So we are having another Data Blitz session now. So we get to hear from 6 PhD students. Again, these are competitively selected students, and they're each going to talk for 5 minutes, and then we get a few minutes in between every talk. So we have Peruz Kambata from Stanford University, Roshni Ravindran, I'm sorry, I'm butchering your name, from the University of Southern California, Ali Lieberman from UCSD, Haley Blundrim from Harvard Business School, Arthur Jago from Stanford, and then Jean Zhao from, used to be from Brown, and now she's a postdoc at Chicago Booth. All right, so we'll kick things off with Peruz. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Juliana. Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Porus, and this is some joint work with Michał Kaczynski. Today I'm going to talk about how a recently developed computational method can help us shed new light on a very old question in social psychology. So we live in a world in which decisions about who to hire, who to date, and who to trust often involve making inferences about what a person is like based on just a picture of a face. So this might lead us to wonder, how well can we infer someone's inner mental life from their outer facial appearance? In particular, how well can we predict someone's personality from just a facial image? Researchers have looked at this in the past, and what they've typically found is that people are not very accurate at this task. For most traits, accuracy doesn't exceed chance, with the exception of extroversion, which people can detect with a low amount of accuracy. And the fact that people are not very good at this has led some researchers to claim that the face might actually not be diagnostic of our personality. So there might not be that much information there about our personality in our faces. So this inspires 2 explanations for our inaccuracy. One hypothesis is that there's just not enough information in our faces to perform this task. But a competing hypothesis is that there is something there, diagnostic of our personality, but people are not able to recognize those cues. And so one way to tease these 2 apart might be to use non-human perceivers. So that is, if a computer can look at a picture of someone's face and tell us something about their personality, that means there must be some information there, and it's just that people aren't very good at picking up on those cues. Okay. Basically, we use a pre-trained deep learning neural network to extract feature vectors for facial images, and then train the regularized linear regression to predict personality.
Pretty much, yeah.
And then we also collected data for image vectors. Okay, so what do we find? Across the x-axis, we have personality. On the y-axis here, we have accuracy, which is operationalized as a correlation between prediction and people's self-worth. Personality score. I'm going to show you the human data first in red. And what we find is that we replicate past findings where extroversion is the only trait that people can detect significantly more accurately than chance. Now I'm going to show you the computer data in blue. So keep in mind, if the blue bars are higher than the red bars, that means the computer is detecting personality more accurately than people are, which is consistent with hypothesis 2, that there is some information there that people are not picking up on. And that's actually what we find. So across the board, I can show a computer a picture of your face, and it can tell me more about what you're like than a person can. So that's kind of interesting and a little scary. But what I think is also interesting is that the pattern of inaccuracy is different. So while people are particularly good at extroversion, that's not necessarily true for the computer. And so what we try to do is figure out, why is that? And why are people not as accurate as the computer? So I think part of it has to do with the way that people learn compared to the way the computer learns. So the computer is training on facial images and learning to associate those with personality. And I think people do something very similar, except in our day-to-day life, we have to rely on our perceptions of other people's personality. So I can go through this room and try to associate each of your faces with personality, but I'm limited by my perception of what I think your personality is. And to the extent that there's error in those perceptions, those errors can carry over when we form inferences about you. And so one thing we tried to do is think about, could we try to teach the computer the way people learn? So what we have in our data set is actually not just people's self-reported personality, but also ratings from their friends. And so we can train the computer on what are called informant ratings of personality. And when we do that, we'll be able to better capture this idea of associating faces with perception. And so here's what happens when we do that. So just to be clear, in the first model, we trained on self-reports, and the criterion we used was self-report accuracy. So now that we're training on other people's ratings of those individuals and still trying to predict self-reports, we would expect the accuracy to be lower. But critically, we would expect it not to be uniformly lower, but to reduce, to idiosyncratically contour the pattern of human inaccuracy. So that is to say, now extroversion is the trait that we're detecting most accurately from the face. And what this suggests is that it's not that there's more information in our faces about extroversion. It's just that we're better at detecting extroversion in the behavior of those around us. And that's what's helping us learn to predict that for strangers. So in conclusion, our limited insight into the minds of strangers may in part be due to our limited insight into the minds of those we already know. And in future directions, we're trying to tease apart some possible alternative hypotheses. So, for instance, these were trained on profile images, profile photos, and so there could be self-presentational motives. So we're trying to collect photos taken within the lab of neutral facial expressions where people have shaved, now wearing makeup, etc., and see if we can replicate these same results. And we're also using other criterions rather than self-reports. And this is also inspired me to think about what else computers could predict better than people can. So I'm working on how computers might not only be able to tell us what someone is like, but also tell us how we're seen, how someone else might form an inference about what we're like, perhaps even better than we can ourselves. As well as potentially predicting our future. So romantic, academic, occupational health outcomes better than we can. So we're in the early phases of running a longitudinal study on that. Okay, thank you all very much.
So, well, thank you all so much for being here. And the future of work is something that in this conference, every one of us is thinking about. This is on our minds. And a lot of novel technologies have already come into the workplace. They're changing the way we engage with work. They're changing the way we engage with each other at work. And I'm going to give you an example here. This is Dr. Christopher Duma at the Hoag Institute here in California. He's a neurosurgeon. He's using a virtual reality device to examine a patient's brain before surgery. This is Nathan, a Walmart employee, also using a virtual reality device for customer relations training. And here, we, in this paper, were very interested in understanding virtual reality and when and why managers use virtual reality computer avatars in the workplace, because VR is one of the top technological trends in 2017. In fact, it's estimated that by 2020, organizations would spend over $140 billion on virtual reality. Another survey revealed that over 66% of 4,000 full-time employees across the world, when they were surveyed, said they would be willing to use virtual reality in the workplace. Well, what virtual reality does, it allows us to use computer avatars in interpersonal interactions. So computer avatars are real-time digital representations of the people controlling these avatars. So essentially, if you use a virtual reality device, you are able to communicate with others in the virtual world as a computer avatar. So as I mentioned earlier, what we're interested in studying is when and why managers use computer avatars to monitor their subordinates. What we're saying is managers will be more likely to use computer avatars when they anticipate being negatively evaluated by subordinates. Now, we studied this in the context of frequent monitoring. This was interesting and important for a couple of different reasons. Well, frequent monitoring is something that as managers, they would have to engage in for a number of different reasons. Well, if they're monitoring new employees who need more direction, and also maybe if they are monitoring people who are working on critical tasks. But the reason why frequent monitoring is interesting is because it can also make people, managers who are doing frequent monitoring, feel more uncomfortable about monitoring their employees much more frequently because they may be called micromanagers. They may come across negatively. So this seemed like a good context to test some of these ideas in. So what we were positing is technology can act as the psychological buffer that can shield managers from this negative evaluation from subordinates, from being perceived as a micromanager, if you will. So that's what we tested. So I just want to quickly give you the formal hypotheses before I get to the experiments. So we hypothesized that managers would be more likely to prefer avatars in situations that called for frequent monitoring, and that this preference would actually be mediated by the extent to which they anticipated being negatively evaluated in that particular situation. So in experiment 1, we had participants in the role of managers, and they were monitoring a team of people who were working on a marketing task. There were 2 conditions: an infrequent monitoring condition, where we said you can check on your subordinate 1 time in a 4-hour period, or you can do that 8 times in a 4-hour period, much more frequently. What we did find, again, here the choice was whether they wanted to do this face-to-face or if they wanted to do this via a computer avatar. We controlled for a number of things, including things like convenience. So they would have to walk down the hall to monitor their subordinates, or they'd have to walk down the hall to a computer room to activate this computer avatar. What we did find was managers were actually more likely to prefer computer avatars when they were supposed to frequently monitor their subordinates. Now, in experiment 2, what we wanted to do was we wanted to think about the role of context and also explore how some personality characteristics would influence, their preferences for using computer avatars. So in addition to manipulating whether they were monitoring their subordinates frequently or infrequently, we also manipulated the context, where we said in a particular context, frequent monitoring is actually more typical versus atypical. Now, again, here the dependent measure was to try and understand if they wanted to choose monitoring face-to-face, go do this directly, or if they wanted to do this via a computer avatar. We also had continuous measures where they rated their preference for using face-to-face as a monitoring method or doing this via avatars. We also measured anticipated negative evaluation. Now, we did not find any context effects. There were no main effects for context or interaction effects, but we did replicate our effect from the first experiment, where managers were more likely to prefer avatars for frequent monitoring. Managers also anticipated more negative evaluation when frequently monitoring their subordinates. And then we conducted some bootstrapping mediational analyses, and we found that this anticipated negative evaluation actually mediated this relationship between frequent monitoring and people's preference for avatars. We did conduct some analyses with the personality measures that we measured, and what we did find was extroversion, conscientiousness, openness to experience, dominance, motivation. They all had a significant negative effect in people's preference for avatars. But neuroticism had a significant positive effect in terms of their preference for avatar. After controlling for the other personality variables, conscientiousness had a marginal effect in the negative direction, and neuroticism had a significant positive effect in terms of their preference for avatars. So these are, again, more exploratory analyses, so we're hoping to sort of develop and see what would come out of this and think about how some of these personality variables might interact with context in people's preference for technology in general, but also for using computer avatars in organizations. Thank you. Yes, David.
Do you think that in high friction contexts, like say performance evaluations, you would also see a similar effect?
Yeah. No, that's exactly what we're hoping to do in the next experiment. So it's not just in contexts like frequent monitoring where managers would anticipate being negatively evaluated, but just in uncomfortable situations. Say, for example, when they have to give negative performance feedback, or if there's difficult sort of news that they have to convey to a subordinate, or even in general. We think that this idea that a technology will act as the psychological buffer that can allow people to have more psychological distance and maybe even make them feel more psychologically safe would be one of the reasons why they would prefer things like virtual reality.
How do you think that would influence the effectiveness of those kind of interactions that need to be attenuated?
I think one of the things that we're really interested in studying in this particular project is also look at it from a dyadic perspective. If managers are turning to technology as a way to buffer themselves from possible negative evaluation or make themselves feel less uncomfortable, we'd be really interested in seeing whether subordinates perceive them to be conscientious, perceive them to be caring and empathetic if they did this via technology. Because it's interesting from the personality variables also that if people were more conscientious, they were less likely to prefer avatars. If they were more neurotic, they were more likely to prefer avatars. So I think there might be some interesting insights we can gain from that.
Well done. Awesome.
Okay, cool. There you go.
All right. Hi, I'm Allie Lieberman, and I'll be speaking with you today about a project I'm doing in collaboration with Ona Mir and Juliana Schroeder. People increasingly are using technologies across a range of different modalities. And within each modality, people can choose to consume a message via different media. So for example, in the visual modality, people may choose to watch something on a television or on a 3D headset. And within the auditory modality, people can choose to listen to a message either via headphones or via speakers. Now, these media vary on a multitude of dimensions, and in this research, we define the sophistication of a medium as its ability to both provide rich content and also decrease external distraction. Here we focus specifically on the auditory modality and propose that listening to a message via a more sophisticated medium, such as headphones, relative to a less sophisticated medium, such as speakers, will actually influence how a listener perceives the communicator and even how they behave toward them. In our paper, we provide a broader theory about how the sophistication of a medium influences several different psychological consequences. And in today's short talk, I'll speak just about a portion of our framework. We heard yesterday quite a bit about how hearing the cues in somebody's voice can influence how someone perceives another. And in this research, we propose that listening to a message via a more sophisticated medium will actually enhance the vividness of those vocal cues, so that's somebody's ability to hear the pitch and volume in another's voice, and that this will increase what we call social immersion, which is the perceived physical and psychological closeness to that other individual. And based on prior literature, we predict that an increase in social immersion will lead to a more positive impression of that person, which is a perceived mental capacity, that they're warmer and more competent, and that this will also influence empathy and even empathy-driven behaviors. So in our first study, we brought participants into the lab and we had them listen to a clip, which was a real mother and daughter speaking about their experience being homeless. Half the participants listened in headphones and half in speakers, and then they reported several measures, social immersion, their impression of the women, and how much empathy they felt toward them. We then asked a donation decision, which is a known consequence of empathy. And we predicted that listening in headphones would increase the vividness of the vocal cues of these women, and that this would increase all of these measures. And indeed, the people who listened in headphones reported being significantly more socially immersed, which was physically and psychologically closer to these women. And this increase in social immersion led to a more positive impression of the women, and they felt more empathy toward them. After responding to these measures, we then said, okay, you're entered into a lottery for $25, and if you happen to win, how much of that $25 would you like to donate to these women? And among the people that donated, those who heard the message in headphones donated significantly more than those who heard the same exact words in speakers. Now, in our second study, we wanted to dig into the mechanism a little bit more, and we now had, again, half the participants listen in headphones and half in speakers. But half of the people heard the same clip that the people in study one heard, this mother and daughter speaking with their natural vocal cues. And then the other half heard a replication of the clip that was two actors reading the same exact words, but we asked them to read it with no thought or feeling. So we removed the vocal cues from their voice. They then reported social immersion and impression. And we predicted that if indeed social immersion and its consequences are being amplified by this vocal cues, then removing them, we should see no difference. And indeed, we found that participants who listened in headphones once again reported greater social immersion and perceiving the communicators as having greater mental capacity. But this was only the case for the people that heard the clip with the natural vocal cues. Those who heard the clip with no vocal cues reported no difference on either measure, no matter with which medium they listened to the message. So just in conclusion, across several studies, we show here that listening to a message via a more sophisticated medium increases social immersion, and that this is driven by the vividness of the vocal cues. And this increase in social immersion can lead to a more positive impression of the communicator heard, and even affect empathy and empathy-driven behaviors. So in a world where we're increasingly exposed to messages every single day, this research is showing that a seemingly inconsequential decision, which is how you listen to that message, can really have predictable and important consequences. Thank you. So the reason that we didn't in this first paper is that for a few different reasons. One, that could act as a confound just by adding in different elements, and we really wanted to focus on the vocal cues. And because based on some of Juliana's previous work, they found that adding the visual aspect really is just redundant on top of the voice. So here we focused really on the voice. Yeah.
Just curious about the vividness aspect. You use actors to remove.
Mm-hmm.
Could we amplify them now?
Could we?
Does it break at some point?
That's a good question. Yeah. We haven't tested that. My intuition is that because we're so used to picking up on these natural vocal cues, if you went the other end, it might start to sound insincere, and you might find the same thing as removing them. That's if it's like with that. It's a good question. In ours, the vividness, so we define vividness as the rich content, but it's really when you're listening in headphones in particular, the noise that you hear is more pure as opposed to speakers. It's bouncing across the room. So another word might be like pure cues. Yeah. I think I'm okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Haley Blunden. I study workplace communication challenges, and I'm really excited to present some work in progress today with my colleagues Andrew Brodsky and Ethan Burris. And the particular workplace communication challenge I'm going to talk about today is employee voice. And for those of you who are not from a management audience, I'm going to define it for you. So the discretionary provision of information intended to improve organizational functioning to someone inside the organization with perceived authority to act, and for us today that's going to be managers, even though this information might challenge the status quo. So voluntary provision of information on the part of employees to someone superior to them that might challenge the status quo with a benevolent motive. So this is like speaking up to your managers. Why do we care about employee voice? Well, it's been associated with a variety of positive organizational outcomes. So performance, reduced turnover, motivation. So we care about employees speaking up, but prior research hasn't attended to how the ways in which we communicate might affect how we speak up. And one particular form of communication has been on the rise in the past few decades, and that's text-based virtual communication. So you don't need me to tell you that this has become really central to our work, with some estimates of 30% of employee time dedicated to email, and some employees checking their email, 37% checking their email constantly. So we're going to ask the question, does this pervasive use of text-based virtual communication, so email, chat, affect employee voice expression? And the specific question we're going to look at with our data is, do those who communicate more with their managers via more text-based communication speak up more or less or neither? And we had reason to think that this relationship might play out in either direction. So on one hand, text-based virtual communication has been associated with increased anonymity of the recipient. So this has been associated with things like more aggressive behavior online. So you might think that those who rely more on text-based virtual communication might actually speak up more, might be willing to challenge those around them more. On the other hand, text-based virtual communication has also been associated with reduced trust. So in that respect, you might think that those who communicate more via text might actually express less voice. So to begin to answer this question, we conducted a survey with a finance client services group at an accounting firm in Australia. Here's what kind of the distribution of the seniority in that data looks like. It was male heavy, it's an accounting firm. So here's going to be our primary outcome measure. So I gave my manager suggestions about how to make work better. I challenged my manager about the problems around here. I speak up to my manager with ideas to address employees' needs and concerns. Our independent measure is going to be the percentage of communication that's conducted via text. And here, in this particular context, that's email and chat, although the results that I'm going to show you will hold if I exclude chat and just look at email. So it's also important to control for some other variables that might affect people's willingness to speak up, as well as their communication medium choices. So we're going to control for some demographic information and for some relational measures, so some measures of the employee's relationship with their manager. So things like leader-member exchange, whether you feel supported by your manager, and how much you interact with your manager, and whether you're in the same building or a different building. So let's see if our data checks out. Yes, as expected, leader-member exchange, which is like feeling supported by your manager, is positively associated with voice, as is manager interaction. The more, if you are in a different building from your manager, you communicate more via text, so that checks out as well. So what did we find? Is text-based communication positively or negatively associated with voice expression? So we actually find a negative relationship. And we find that this holds when we control for all of those demographic and relational variables that we could measure. So we wanted to understand a little bit more about the mechanism, about what was going on behind this. So we conducted interviews. And in those interviews, we asked about employees' voice expressions, so how much they're speaking up. And then we probed for their communication medium use. And what seemed to emerge is that those employees who were communicating a lot more via text perceived fewer windows or fewer opportunities to express this voice in order to speak up. And they mention these opportunities in the context of medium characteristics, the relational level, and the organizational level. So we're really excited about this initial data, and we have new data that we're going to be analyzing that has a more objective measure, not a self-report survey measure, of both communication patterns and of employee voice, which is going to be manager-rated, excuse me. And we're also planning to conduct an experience sampling study in order to dig deeper into the mechanism. So with that, I'll thank you, and I'll ask if you want to challenge my views. Yes. So that's really interesting. So this, to answer your question very specifically, this data does not look at that. I think it would be interesting in that making it anonymous may remove some of the trust factor that could be going on here. So the fact that you're going to have to deal with your manager's reaction to that, and that if it's anonymous, you kind of would avoid that. But I think we're interested in employee voice, in employees directly speaking up, because then they're able to kind of potentially work with their manager in order to come to a good solution for their issue. But thank you. I think it'd be interesting to look at. Let's talk later.
Can everyone hear me? Hello. My name's Arthur Jago. I'm finishing up my PhD a little bit away at Stanford, and today I'm going to be talking about technology and discrimination. So as many of you know, organizations are rapidly automating the process of human evaluation in organizations. There are a number of startup companies in the Bay Area, like Twine, for example, who if you give them money, they'll let you use their proprietary algorithms to try and figure out if this new candidate you're considering is actually going to be good or not. And many companies that you've heard of, including Google, have sort of flirted with internal human resource algorithms themselves. But there's a lot of interesting research in this area suggesting that these types of algorithms, as Porras was kind of talking about earlier, tend to outperform human experts, for example, hiring managers. So these algorithms' prevalence inspired our research question, which is, well, do people think algorithmic evaluation is as discriminatory as human evaluation? So we ran a bunch of studies looking at this. So in the first study that we ran, like many of you who have had great conversations with this conference and last year, our goal was to look at, well, do people respond differently to recommendations made by a person compared to a machine? So we brought a bunch of Stanford students and staff into the laboratory, and we asked them about a recommendation made by either a person or an algorithm. And specifically, we told them that either this person or this algorithm worked in an organization, and it was this agent's job to handle employee referrals and provide a recommendation about whether or not to bring a candidate in for an interview. And more specifically, participants read that they'd see the outcome of 2 ostensibly real referrals. So then they saw the 2 referrals. These are what they looked like. If this was the huge screen from the other room, this would be way more pixelated, so I'm glad that I'm here. And so we modeled these referrals after ones actually used in tech companies in the Bay Area. So they'll have, for example, candidate name, where they went to school, their legality to work, a bunch of quantitative ratings along a variety of dimensions like reliability, intelligence, and then a short qualitative recommendation. So all participants saw 2 referrals. And crucially, they saw one referral that had a characteristically Caucasian name, like Max Johnson, whereas the second had a characteristically non-Caucasian name, for example, Zhang Wei. We counterbalanced and randomized all the other information in these experiments. For example, half the participants saw that Max went to Santa Clara, the other half saw UC Santa Cruz. None of that ever explained anything. And we pulled these names from census data, and we actually used a number of different comparisons. For example, East Asian, South Asian, African American, Hispanic, and Arabic. And in all of these cases, as I might have foreshadowed, either this person or this algorithm decides to bring in a Caucasian candidate, but not bring in a non-Caucasian candidate. And then after this, we asked participants, well, how discriminatory was this? And what we found was people actually believed the algorithm's decision was less discriminatory compared to the identical recommendation made by a person. So in study 2, we wanted to use a natural dependent measure. We brought people into lab. They saw the exact same materials. But this time we used an open-ended response to kind of capture their reactions to the situation. We asked them, well, what information do you think this person or the AI, again, the only manipulation in this experiment was the name, used about the applicants to make this decision? So people took it seriously. They talked about all sorts of things like the intelligence rating, the positivity. And what we did was we coded these qualitative responses for explicitly mentioning the candidate's ethnicity. So for example, it is possible they inferred something about the race of the applicants, probably ethnicity implied by the name. And consistent with the first study, what we found is that people believed the person was more likely to use this information compared to an algorithm. And importantly, pre-test suggested that this is not because people believed the algorithm couldn't access or use this information. People believed that the algorithm chose not to use this information. In the last study I'll talk about, we wanted to look at, well, what are the potential organizational consequences of this kind of effect? So we asked a bunch of Stanford alumni, gave them the same materials they read about either an algorithm or a person. This time we used gender instead of ethnicity, though. They saw 2 referrals, one with a male name, one with a female name. Again, we used a bunch of different names. And they read that this agent decided to bring in the male candidate and then not the female candidate. And so in addition to discrimination, we asked people very broadly whether or not they wanted to sign a petition that we investigate this incident. And we made this really broad on purpose. And what we found is that people were overwhelmingly wanted us to investigate the situation involving the machine. People are really curious about technology. They want to know more about it. They wanted us as researchers to get involved. But we see a significant suppression effect that because people believed the algorithm's decision was less discriminatory, they were more OK with us not investigating it, despite this larger total effect. So the one takeaway I'd want you to have from this talk is that algorithms appear less discriminatory than people, even as we discussed earlier, they aren't, for example, in the context of parole decisions. So thank you. Any questions? Yes?
So 2 classical models in econ, at least, of discrimination are statistical discrimination and then outright prejudice.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking perhaps intuitively people, even if they haven't studied economics, separate the 2 and say, OK,
yeah.
computers can't be prejudiced, but they can be statistical.
Absolutely. So we were really concerned about that as a potential explanation. So that's one of the reasons why we conducted the second experiment, was just not using those kinds of words. But in all the materials, I didn't have time to go out today, we took a lot of care to refer specifically to the outcome, saying this decision, this outcome, with this thing that's actually happening in the world. That said, I think that's an alternative explanation that's sort of always on our mind and something we're trying to address. Thank you, guys.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that, OK. My name is Xuan. I'm very happy to be back to my favorite small conference and it has been very exciting so far, so thank you. My heartfelt thanks to Nate and Juliana and all the organizers here. And last year, I talked about people taking the perspectives of human-looking robots. And I promised my audience a research update this year. So very quickly, this year I built a database with my collaborator / PhD advisor, Bertrand Mallet. I have a database of about 200 robots, and thousands of people rated the robots on 20 dimensions. So if you are interested in human-robot interaction or anthropomorphism, definitely talk to me. This year, I want to switch gear a bit and talk about human-human interaction. Specifically, I want to explore the potential of a new modality of social connection. That is technology-mediated affect sharing. Specifically, I want to talk about the psychological effect of feeling the representation of another person's heartbeat. So, heartbeat. Well, the collaborators, Malte, sitting right over there from Cornell, other collaborators from the East and West Coast, and also SPSP for the founding. Heartbeat, the pulsation that conveys your livelihood, tracks your physical conditions, and reveals your innermost feelings. Nowadays, it's very common for people to use heart rate monitoring devices to track their physical and emotional health. But the heart is more than a blood pump. Actually, ancient Egyptians, when they preserved mummies, they destroyed the brains but preserved the heart because they believe that's the true self. And heart, the symbol, has been used across different cultures, across history, to give you this warm, fuzzy feeling about other people. The heartbeat is a visceral representation of another person's being. No wonder there has been emerging affective communication technology enabling people to feel others' heartbeat or the representation of others' heartbeat using devices such as the Apple Watch. And there has been initial user studies studying how this kind of a new form of social connection can make partners feel closer, emotional intimacy over long distance. But can the power of feeling the representation of another's heartbeat go beyond romantic relationships and maybe create stronger social connection or cooperation, even among strangers? So that's my research question. Can feeling the representation of another human's heartbeat promote pro-social and cooperative behaviors? To make people feel others' heartbeat, we use this device I borrowed from our collaborators, and this device can pick up the signal from a heart rate monitor and gives off this rhythmic vibration to represent the heartbeat. And I put that into a red pouch and let participants hold this device and go through decision-making tasks. So in order to measure pro-social and cooperative behaviors, I let them go through the dictator game, where you decide how to divide money between yourself and another person. Trust game, or you decide how much money to entrust to another person, to your partner. Money will be tripled, and that person might return some money back to you. And deception game is a conflict between telling self-benefiting lies or actually telling the truth, which might hurt your self-interest. Would people be more willing to be honest to the other person if they can feel the other's heartbeat? And to make sure if there's any effect to feeling others' heartbeat, it's not because people are more risk-taking, they feel like giving more money. We also have a non-social control task, which is people give money to the lottery. So the conditions, people feel their own the other's heartbeat, or actually we told them they feel the other person's heartbeat, which is not true. I'll review that. Or in comparison, they were told that they feel their own heartbeat. Or the mechanical condition is they hold the same vibration device, but were told that this is pre-programmed. Or the heartless condition, which they did not hold a vibration device at all. And between subject design, and actually the heartbeat signal was identical across all conditions, and we staged this interaction. There was no other partner. It's always a very stable heartbeat. So how did people respond? While in the dictator game, when people felt the other's heartbeat, they were more likely to give money to the partner compared to when they are feeling their own heartbeat. And the other two conditions, they stay in between. The trust game, when people believed that they felt the other person's heartbeat, they were more likely to trust the other person than when they believed that they felt their own heartbeat. And again, the other conditions stay in between. And deception game. When people believe that they feel the other's heartbeat, they were more likely to be honest to the other person than when they felt their own heartbeat. Now, again, the other two conditions stayed in between. And the lottery game, people were not responding differently in the lottery game when they were not interacting with the other partner. There was an unexpected difference between the other condition and the heartless condition, maybe saying something about priming the concept of heart altogether. So we thought, okay, there's a fact, the difference between the self and the other condition. Why was that? And was it because people felt that they were closer to the other person? So we asked them to respond to a few questions, but surprisingly, they didn't verbally respond any difference in closeness, which wasn't what I was expecting. Also, there was a small difference between the other and the heartless condition. So to conclude, when feeling another person's heartbeat rather than their own, people were more likely to share resources with the other person, more likely to trust the other person, and more likely to be honest to the other person. And we did not detect a difference in their self-reported perceived closeness. And the other conditions, they lie in between. So new direction one is why. In my current study, I'm just exploring the mechanisms here. I think there are 3-4 potential mechanisms here and ways to apply it. I mean, as a psychologist who always wished to be a designer in my next life, I have been thinking a lot about potential applications, and I think it's only limited by imagination. So your questions. Yes. Well, I'd say that actually I think the problem is a low power to detect any difference. I don't think it's either it's closer to the control conditions than self. So that's why, for one thing, I'm increasing the power sample size in the next study to detect any difference. So I don't think it's just about feeling your own heartbeat. And it's also about feeling the other person's heartbeat. So maybe both directions. And on free will, I think that's an interesting candidate. I haven't thought about it. I've thought about 4 candidates, but free will may be adding a 5th to it. I'm still trying to connect the dots on how free will makes you less pro-social. I think by itself, it could be an interesting hypothesis. Yeah, and I'm also trying to, I don't have the intuition that feeling your heartbeat decreases your free will, but that could be another, yeah. Thank you. Yes. Yay.